Sometimes I just feel like a broken vessel. Bringing everything to God. Thank you for God's amazing grace. It reaches down, wraps his arms around us, picks us up. Says, okay, I got it covered. My grace is sufficient. Can you breathe that in? Thank you, God, for your amazing grace that covers us, takes all our worries, takes all our fears. Said, I got you. All these pieces, broken and scattered, in mercy gathered, mended and whole, empty-handed, but not forsaken. I've been made whole. I've been made whole. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see it now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. Thank you, God. Take our failures, you take our weakness. You set your treasure in jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your vessel, the world to see your light in me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see it now. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. Amazing grace.
Thank you. I really do appreciate the worship team here this morning and just the way they're able to lead us into worship and responding to God. And so, have you been in any good conflicts lately? Some that were not so good, maybe. And by the way, is there really such a thing as a good conflict? And if there is, just what does that look like anyway? Is a good conflict when you win? Or is win or lose even a helpful way to talk about conflicts? And of course, part of what complicates those kinds of questions is that we're not always very consistent when we talk about how to deal with conflict. I mean, sometimes we say things like, you should take a stand and fight for what you believe. And we might even regard those who do that as heroes. But at other times, we say, it's probably just better to let it go, because getting into it only feeds it, and it just makes things worse. Apparently, not all conflict is created equal, and neither are the ways that we respond to them. In fact, some would say that how we respond to conflict may tell us as much about who we are as it does about whatever the issue is that we might be in conflict over. Okay, so what then is the best approach to dealing with conflict? Being firm, settled, convicted about what you believe, or being open-minded and willing to listen and learn, maybe grow? And does it have to be one or the other? I mean, is it possible to hold those two stances at the same time so that we embody and reflect the very best of both? Or do the feelings that conflict sometimes stirs in us, things like anxiety and fear and insecurity and even some old prejudices, they often get in the way of that? Do you ever find yourself conflicted over how to deal with conflict? And I suppose whatever else we might want to say about it this morning, that perhaps the one thing that we can probably all agree upon is that being in conflict is generally not something that most of us are drawn to. Some of you may be, but that's another topic for another time. Most of us would just as soon avoid conflict if we could. And yet, as it turns out, getting into conflict is exactly what I would like to invite you to do this morning. Because the chapter in the book that we're supposed to be thinking about this week is all about that, conflict. And I'm hoping we can get into it without creating too much of it. So if you've been here, you know that for the past several weeks in our sermon series, we've been following the flow of John Ortberg's book, Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them, which immediately reminded me of this pillow that we have on our family room couch at home. I think we can kind of show you a picture of it here, possibly. There it is, in case you can't read it. It says, "Remember, as far as anyone knows, we are a nice, normal family." So there's that. And as the book suggests, and as we quickly discover when we get to know each other a little better, what we often think of as normal is actually a bit of illusion when it comes to who we really are. But fortunately, what we've also been reminded of in this series so far is that as followers of Jesus, we're invited to come just as we are, the real normal, into a community where we are genuinely accepted as is, as a part of God's family, and where relationships are grounded in grace, which ironically can sometimes feel a bit abnormal to us, because a lot of what we experience in the world around us is often not like that. Which is probably one of the reasons why, when we genuinely do come just as we are, out of some of those places, that being the kind of community together that God invites us into can be challenging for us. And at no time is that probably more evident than when we find ourselves in conflict, particularly if there is something about the conflict that leaves us feeling anxious or threatened or stirs a lot of other stuff in us. And we find ourselves maybe even wanting to react by withdrawing, or on the other hand, maybe becoming a bit prickly, slipping into what Pastor John was talking about a couple weeks ago as the dance of the porcupines, which is about as comfortable and graceful as it sounds. But whether it's getting prickly or withdrawing or whatever other form it may take, not all of the reactions we have when it comes to building the kind of community that we're invited into are particularly helpful. All of which then brings us back to the topic for this morning: how we go about dealing with conflict in the midst of a community in such a way that we still have a community when we're done. Because if we can't find a way to do that in a healthy way, we simply won't have one. At least not the kind of community that Jesus is talking about. It's part of what many millennials have been trying to tell us for a while now when they talk about the importance of creating safe spaces. And despite the fact that that sometimes gets ridiculed in some segments of our culture these days, what that reflects is a rather profound truth: that being in a place and among people where you can put down the quills and actually be vulnerable and come just as you are is a prerequisite for genuine community. Well, okay then, so how do we do that? Well, there are solutions out there. Some might say that the simplest and most obvious answer is to find a way to eliminate conflict. If we could just agree on everything and quit questioning or rethinking or learning new things, or find some way to make sure that if we do, that we only accept those things that don't make us have to rethink anything that we thought we already had figured out, then we could live without conflict, and life would go much smoother, and we would all be united. You know, maybe you could just make a list of the way things actually are. Put 28 items on it, form a compliance committee, and have everybody sign off, be done with it, and your problem will be solved. And it sounds easy enough at first, and there is kind of a certain logic to that, at least as long as you don't think about it too much. But you know, as someone once said, for every complex, challenging problem, there is a simple, easy to understand and articulate solution. That is wrong. And there are a number of reasons why that kind of solution doesn't really work very well. We've talked about some of these already, but let me just review a couple of them. For one thing, it confuses conformity with unity. While getting people to conform might, in the short term, seem like an efficient way to suppress conflict and get things done, we all know it's really not a very good long-term solution. Because while conformity is what you get when you suppress conflict, unity and community is what you get when conflict is resolved, which is what we see illustrated so well in the greatest of all conflicts that we are aware of, what we as Adventists call the Great Controversy, the Great Conflict. God could have modeled an approach that suppressed conflict and achieved a forced conformity as soon as there was an issue. He is big enough and powerful enough to do that. But instead, he chose a way that ultimately leads to resolution and unity instead. I like the way that Ellen White comments about this on page 22 of Desire of Ages, and you've heard me quote this passage before, but it's worth hearing again. Here's what she writes. The earth was dark through misapprehension of God, that the gloomy shadows might be lightened, that the world might be brought back to God. Satan's deceptive power was to be broken. This could not be done by force. The exercise of force is contrary to the principles of God's government. He desires only the service of love, and love cannot be commanded. It cannot be won by force or by authority. Only by love is love awakened. And so there is that. But another reason that seeking to eliminate conflict by suppressing it is not a very helpful approach is that even though we do live in the context of the great controversy between good and evil, that does not mean that all conflict is about that. Not all conflict is something that should make us anxious, and not all conflict is about rebellion. Sometimes it's simply about learning and growing and perhaps even maturing. It may just be about discovering something new that might help us understand things better. I mean, you will remember that it was Jesus who repeatedly said in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." And then he would go on and say something that challenged what they thought they already knew, and then invite them to rethink it and go a little bit deeper. You see, the conflict he created was actually a good thing. Not all conflict or tension we experience is a threat to what unites us. Just like when we exercise, you know that tension you feel when you contract and work a muscle against resistance? That's part of the process that actually strengthens the muscle and helps you be able to do more than you could do before. And sometimes that process actually can turn out to be fun, as some of you have discovered. But as you may also have discovered, is that even when it is just hard work, and we find it taxing and challenging, there is this thing called stretching that often helps relieve the discomfort a bit. The willingness to stretch a bit helps, and it's also pretty good for preventing injuries. Stretching. As John Ortberg points out in the beginning of chapter 7, in a quote from Jean Vanier, here's something I'd like you to be thinking about as we continue. He writes, "Communities need tensions if they are to grow and deepen. Tensions come from conflicts. A tension or difficulty can even signal the approach of a new grace of God. But it has to be looked at wisely and humanly. It has to be looked at wisely." You know, one of the reasons that we sometimes get anxious is that we actually confuse natural growing pains with what we are afraid might be the symptoms of some kind of a disease. Those of you who are physicians probably have these conversations with patients all the time. And so in those cases, when wisdom gets replaced by fear, instead of listening carefully to Jesus reminding us that, sometimes new wine needs to be put into new wineskins, we try to fix the problem by taking the old wineskins and, wrapping them in duct tape, which in the long run can create quite a mess as the wineskins continue to deteriorate. And sometimes, after the wine has long been spilled and gone, all we are left with is this sticky wad as the fruit of our labors. Not to mention that we just make ourselves look silly to those who are watching us from the outside. See, in some cases, it's how we respond that may actually create the disease, where nothing was present before. And we have seen that before. Religious leaders at the time of Jesus struggled with the conflict and the perceived lack of unity that his ministry created. And we know how that went. The early church struggled with conflicts between how they had always read Scripture in regard to Gentiles and the reality of how God was leading by fully including them as is into the life and ministry of the church, even without circumcision. And we know how that went. Religious leaders during the Middle Ages struggled with the conflict between the way they had been used to reading their Bible and the work of scientists like Copernicus and Galileo, and reformers like Martin Luther and many of his colleagues, all of whom were out of compliance with the church at the time. And we know how that went. And religious leaders in our own Adventist church in the 1880s and the 1970s, to name just a couple of instances that some of you might remember, at least the second one, they struggled with a conflict that was brought about by making Jesus and grace, rather than law and performance, the central focus of our message. Something that not all global church leaders were enthusiastically embracing at the time, and something that many of them are still struggling with in some parts of the world today. And we still are seeing how that went. So we shouldn't really be surprised. Conflict is nothing new. It's a part of the life of the church. It has been for a very long time. And in those cases when it is dealt with wisely, alert for how the Spirit is leading, it is not something we have to be afraid of either. It may actually provide opportunities to learn and to grow and mature and see what else God is up to. And so there is that kind of conflict, the kind that only becomes a problem for us if we make it a problem. But if we do manage to make it a problem, then conflict can go on to another level that becomes much more of a problem. It's when conflict moves beyond differences in the way we understand things to differences in the way that we treat people. When conflict becomes personal in unhealthy ways that does not encourage a healthy sense of community and leaves us in some pretty dark spots. So then, what do we do when anxious feelings like hurt and fear and anger begin to surface in the midst of those conflicts in ways that seem to invite us to join once again in the dance of the porcupines? What do we do with it then? Well, one thing to keep in mind in the midst of all of this is that there are, of course, times when feeling sad or hurt or angry, just to name a few emotions, is an appropriate response to what is going on. Like when we experience injustice or loss or people being demeaned or the truth being disregarded. Jesus felt all of those emotions. And so there are those feelings that should not be of concern to us. They're quite appropriate for the situation. And yet there are also times when feelings like, say, anger, for example, when it becomes particularly intense, may need some management and put within some bounds of compliance so that feelings don't get expressed in inappropriate ways or destructive ways or ways where people get hurt. But even then, those feelings are still telling us something important, something that needs to be processed, not something that needs to be suppressed. At least if we really do want to avoid the porcupine dance and actually have the kind of community that Jesus invites us into. And that's what the last phrase in that quote from Ortberg's book that we were looking at just a few moments ago is getting at. See if we can get it back again. And notice how it ends again. A tension or difficulty can signal the approach of a new grace of God, but it also has to be looked at wisely and humanly. Wisely and humanly. Remembering that conflict is not just about how ideas interact, but it's also about how people relate to each other. Ideas may conflict, but it's people that get into conflicts. Because relationships are not just about what we think, but they're also about who we are and how we feel. And it's the ability to be able to live in both of those places, to do both of those things, that is a huge part of what makes us human. and it's also what makes healthy community possible. But it is also what strains relationships and communities when things go wrong. And it's when we don't take that seriously that conflicts tend to go badly. But again, the good news is that when we do take it seriously, there is great hope for restoration and for healing and for growth. Which, not surprisingly, is what we find reflected in the words of Jesus when we listen to what Jesus actually does have to say about conflict. And that's what I'd like to invite you to do with me for the next couple of moments, is notice just a couple of those places where we find Jesus talking about how to navigate conflict. The first passage I'd like to take you to this morning is one that's not found in chapter 7 of Ortberg's book. He didn't ask me before he wrote the chapter. I think it should be there, but we'll take you there anyway. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, and it's right there in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is addressing not only appropriate ways to resolve conflict, but also the way that we deal with people in the process. Listen to what he says, beginning in verse 21 of chapter 5. You have heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. So murder clearly is not an appropriate way to express feelings or to resolve conflict. Got that? But simple compliance, though certainly appropriate, apparently for Jesus is not enough. Listen to what he says as he continues. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. See, Jesus points out that at the heart of the problem here is the anger that drives the reaction to the conflict. Well, wait a minute, then. Is Jesus saying that feeling angry is wrong and that we should not try to, and that we really should try to suppress what we're feeling, anger being one of those? And a lot of people have come to that conclusion. But the problem with that, as we've already noticed, is that the Gospels actually tell us that on many occasions, particularly when people were being treated badly, Jesus himself was angry. So there has to be more to it than that. So what is Jesus getting at? What is he saying? Well, fortunately, he continues on to help clarify that. Let's listen to what he says. Verse 22. Again, anyone who says to his brother or sister, raka, a harsh, demeaning term that was used in those days, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Do you hear what Jesus is saying? It's when we express anger in ways that depersonalize, demean, dehumanize the people that we have conflict with, when we make them somehow in some way less than we are, less deserving, less entitled, people who we only get to after we've got to us. It's then that we have moved on to dangerous ground, he says, where powerful emotional content then gets channeled into hurtful, destructive behavior. And when we treat people like that for any reason, we destroy the ability for conflict to be resolved in anything that even looks like a healthy way. And even if we manage not to actually commit murder, we have certainly not dealt with the problem that is driving the impulse, which, if not resolved, will still likely find a way to play itself out in some other more subtle way. In fact, this principle is so important when it comes to the kind of community that Jesus invites us into, that he goes on to say in the next verse, verse 23, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. For the sake of the community we are called to, Jesus says, make that your first priority. We cannot be a community that trusts each other if we don't feel safe with each other. So as we reflect on what Jesus is saying here as it relates to dealing with conflict, there's already a couple of things that begin to surface, but probably the most important, the core issue here, is that this is not about trying to figure out who is right, as much as it is about how we relate to each other, even when we do have differences. Well, that's one passage. The second passage I'd like to take you to this morning is the one that Ortberg does spend a lot of time in the book unpacking. In fact, he spends almost the whole chapter in this passage, and we're just going to be able to summarize a couple of things here. You'll have to read the whole chapter if you want to get everything he says. But that passage is found in chapter 18 of Matthew. While Matthew 5 talks about what to do if we have hurt someone, Matthew 18 gives us some general guidance about what to do if our conflict is with someone who has hurt us. So let's notice what Jesus says here, beginning in verse 15 of Matthew 18. Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. It's an interesting passage. Now, one of the things to keep in mind as we're reading the passage is that the Jesus speaking here in chapter 18 is the same Jesus who was also speaking in chapter 5. And so what I'd like to suggest to you is that what we have here again is not a prescription for how to effectively win an argument, especially with someone who you have something against, which is the way that sometimes people read this passage, but rather a passage that gives us some helpful insights into how to go about bringing healing to relationships with those who have hurt us. These are broad, general insights. And each one of these, we could talk about some ways where you might want to do it slightly differently. But the broad flow of what he's saying is significant here. Let's notice what he says. Jesus, beginning in verse 15, says, if your brother or sister sins against you, okay, that reminds us that the first step is to be willing to move to a stance where we are no longer pretending that everything is just fine when we know it's not. And that by itself is not always easy for us. Sometimes we don't want to deal with the tension that exists between someone who has hurt us and ourselves. But the truth is we can't fix what we won't admit is broken. And so Jesus starts out by saying, or acknowledging that there may be something there that needs to be fixed. He then goes on to the next step as we continue in verse 15, and he says, so go and point out their fault just between the two of you. So whether what they did was unintentional or whether it was intentional and they need to own it, still Jesus seems to encourage being honest about the pain or the hurt that we are experiencing. We could talk about how if there was more space here and we knew more of what he said, he would probably encourage us to use I messages rather than you messages when we have that conversation. We can talk more about that another time. But while it's not an easy thing to do, actually being willing to talk with others is an important part of the healing process when we're hurt. Now, having said that already, let me add a qualifying statement here so that we don't overread what Jesus is saying and make things worse than they already are. As Jesus goes on to say in the passage that there are times when it's helpful for others to be involved in those conversations. He's going to talk about some of that a little bit as we move on. But sometimes, and I just want to be clear about this, there are times when that probably needs to be taking place in that first step. When Jesus describes a generally healthy approach to take in most situations, while he does that, if it turns out that we're seeking to reconcile and heal the relationship with someone who has hurt us in very deep and painful ways, to such an extent that we do not feel either physically or emotionally safe to be with them, especially alone with them, then we should not go alone. Don't read Jesus' words as encouraging you to do that. You don't do that until you feel confident that you can do that without putting yourself at risk. So that you can have the best chance for a healthy outcome, that will mean that if you're going to attempt to make those contacts that spending some time with a good counselor first is a really good idea. And it may turn out that going alone is not the best approach. It may be that there are other ways to initiate that contact. But having said all of that, like I said, you can find qualifications for each of these broad principles. Still, when we are able to have those conversations with people who have hurt us in some way, in a healthy and safe way, Jesus goes on to comment then, if they listen to you, if they hear you, you have won them over. And that is a good thing. Well, but as we read on, we discover that Jesus is also quite realistic about this. Sometimes resolving the conflict is more challenging. And so he goes on to say, but if they will not listen, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Have you ever noticed sometimes that even in healthy communities, especially during times of conflict, that it is sometimes hard for us to really hear what other people are saying, to really understand how they may be hurting, to really notice what's going on with them, maybe because we're being a bit self-protective ourselves. But if we are willing to listen, good, trusted friends who are willing to be honest with us can sometimes help us to see things about ourselves, to hear things that we just can't seem to do on our own. Again, this is not about a process of winning or proving that we are right or stacking up people to make our argument, but it's about an opportunity to listen to other people that we trust who can help us to see what we can't. Sounds like a pretty helpful step. Well, Jesus says, and in verse 17, if they still refuse to listen after that, tell it to the church. Well, that's the one that some of us have been waiting for. But let me just suggest to you that this is not an invitation to make it a matter of gossip. It is more likely the kind of statement that acknowledges that sometimes when you don't have the resources to deal with a particularly tough situation, there is a larger community that you can look to for resources. So it's not an opportunity to publicly shame. It's an opportunity to say, maybe I can enlist the support of others who know how to help me deal with this. And depending on the nature of the situation, there may be resources in the community outside the church as well that would be helpful to consult. So Jesus continues to kind of nudge people towards health and growth. And then finally, in verse 17 again, he says, and if they refuse to listen even to that, even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector, keeping in mind the way that Jesus treated pagans and tax collectors. Sadly, Jesus allows for the reality, though, that not all attempts at reconciliation and healing succeed. After we have tried all we know how to do, we may actually come to the place where we realize that, at least for now, the person or the entity is simply not willing. Not all conflicts resolve easily. Which then brings us back to the questions that we started with. Well, so then, what is the best approach to dealing with conflict? Should I just say firm and settled and convicted about what I believe? Should I be open-minded and willing to listen and learn and grow? Do I have to choose between the two? Or is it possible actually to hold those two stances at the same time together so that we can embody and reflect the best of both? Even when all the feelings and conflict and things that stir within us that sometimes obscure issues, but yet at other times give us clues as to what the issues really are all swirling around in the midst of that. I think the answer that God gives to us is in the midst of all of that, we are still invited to be a community grounded in grace. A community that's willing to look at things wisely and humanly. One that is open to learning and growing in healthy ways and seeking reconciliation when other things get in the way of that. And a community who is willing to do that everywhere, in our homes, in our relationships with each other, in our church, locally and globally, and in our world as we continue to live alongside of those that we are trying to reach out to and have an impact on. Sometimes that means resisting the temptation to depersonalize other people and being a little bit more focused about how to listen and understand better, because it's always about people, not just ideas. Sometimes it means finding ourselves echoing the sentiments of Martin Luther, who, when he found himself in conflict with the church that he loved and very much wanted to be a part of, despite his efforts, finally had to say, "Here I stand, I can do no other." The next move is with them. Sometimes it means reaching out and listening to others who have been hurt by us, even if it was unintentional, because their pain is real, whether or not we fully understand it, whether or not we tried to inflict the pain, whether or not it's even something we can wrap our minds around. We can still afford to listen and to appreciate what it's like for them. And sometimes it means reaching out as best we can in healthy ways, even to those who have hurt us, even if it doesn't end the way we hope it could. Because even when it's hard and frustrating and messy, that's who God calls us to be. And at least in our best moments, it's who we really want to be too. And sometimes it may mean living with the possibility that I could be wrong about some things. I don't know what I don't know, and there's always more stuff to learn. But when everything is said and done, I would rather be in doctrinal error and treat people in a way that reflects God's character than to be technically correct but treat them in a way that denies it. As John Ortberg suggests, being that kind of community is worth fighting for. And I believe he's right. Father in heaven, we thank you this morning for who you are, and that we might be together a community that reflects that same character to each other and to the world around us is our prayer this morning. We are so grateful and so honored to be a part of what you are doing in this world. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.